Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. Check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, and leave a comment. Share this podcast and let people know about Intimate Judaism so that we can bring more of these important conversations into the Jewish world. Join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of this podcast and in the show notes. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com and visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. And Talli, today we have part 2 of our episode on fertility. The reason I call it episode as opposed to episodes, we originally intended this to be a single episode, but Dr. Amy Barron was on last time and was so enlightening and gave us so much information, we decided that that would be a standalone episode, and now we have part 2 today.
Yeah, there really is so much to say. This is an area that cuts across so many different areas of our life, spiritual and halachic and medical and couples dynamics and emotional. We have a lot to say. So I think that it was great to have that introductory episode with Dr. Barron. She really gave us a good idea of what couples go through. And today I hope to hear from you about some of the halachic issues. And we can also talk about some of the emotional issues and sexual issues that couples experience in their journey of infertility as well as pregnancy loss.
So let's jump right in. Before I talk about the halachic issues, though, I want to echo something which Dr. Barron said last time, and you and I both mentioned last time as well, which is that this is a topic which causes a lot of pain for people. At the very end of the episode, Dr. Barron talked about how it's very hard to know what to say, and people have to be willing to be fallible and to be imperfect and to say, oh, I didn't mean to say that. That was offensive or that was upsetting. This is a topic which really triggers people, and so many people in the Jewish community and in the world are dealing with infertility, as we mentioned last time, particularly around the Amim Noraim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, people going to shul, seeing families, all of the talk about how Hashem remembered Sarah, Rachel, Hannah, and gave them children, and people can say, as Dr. Barron mentioned, but what about me? How come I don't have that? So it's a really difficult topic, and I want to make sure that even though when I speak about some of these halachic issues, Talli, it's almost cold and calculating, talking about the technical halachic issues, that's not at all meant to ignore the real emotional quotient that's here as well. It's very, very serious. When we talk about halacha, we talk about the specifics of Jewish law, but that's not to disregard the very, very serious other issues too.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I think that we really have to be able to integrate the halachic issues and also recognize that there's going to be couples that will want halachic guidance every step of the way. And there are also going to be couples who may choose not to consult rabbis every step of the way, specifically for those reasons that they just can't handle that emotionally because of everything else that's going on. The other thing about this, as you mentioned, not knowing what to say, and also the fact that people don't really talk about these things openly, is here in Intimate Judaism, we're already talking about a subject that people don't talk about openly. So what we're going to be talking about today is really not just the fact that infertility is often a big secret, but also sex is something that people don't talk about. So couples can find themselves feeling very lost and alone, because even if they're going through the medical aspects with the doctors and they're going through the halachic questions with the rabbi, what sort of guidance are they getting, if any, regarding what's happening to them in their intimate lives when they're being told when they can have sex, when they shouldn't have sex, when they have to have sex, when they don't really want to have sex, and how that can wreak havoc. And also, this is another issue, the fact that we don't always know if the infertility may primarily be coming from an issue of sexual dysfunction to begin with. And sometimes that's not even asked about. I think that this creates a lot of complexity around this whole issue. So I appreciate you saying that you recognize that talking about kind of dry halachic issues could appear to be insensitive to the pain that couples are going through. And I think that that's something that is so important to recognize. But I think it's also important to get some background in what the issues are because if we can acknowledge them, we can also validate how painful it might be to go in that direction. But for some couples, it might actually be very soothing for them to know that they're following the halacha exactly how they're being told to. And everyone's different.
Okay, Talli. So with that, I want to outline some of the basic halachic issues involved. As you said correctly, it is very complicated and very complex. This is not a complete guide to everything. It's simply some of the issues. In fact, I always say I don't give psak, but this is more than that. I'm not even necessarily going to say that you do this or that in most cases. I'm simply going to outline some of the issues that, according to Jewish law, are relevant and that people, should they choose to do so, should ask their halachic decisor about. So the first one would be the question of pru or vu. Pru or vu means the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. It's the first mitzvah in the Torah. Appears in Parshat Bereshit and or Parshat Noach, depending on who you ask. And we talked about this in episodes 37 and 38 regarding contraception. The problem with contraception, or one of the problems potentially with contraception, is the commandment of pru or vu. You can't just decide, I don't want to do this commandment according to Jewish law. It is an obligation for men to have children. Technically speaking, a boy and a girl, each of whom on their own is able to reproduce two. This is sort of the flip side of that. Let's say a couple is having a hard time with fertility. How much must they work to overcome that? Does the mitzvah of pru require them to not just not use contraception, but to actively have medical intervention in order to try and have children? That's one question. How much do you have to do? Are they required to undergo invasive medical treatments? How much is enough? Are they able to fulfill this mitzvah in other ways, perhaps through adoption or something else? That's one question about that. Now, the second issue that comes up in halacha is assuming that they are trying to fulfill the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply, pru or vu, what methods are there? And Talli, I saw a very interesting article by Rabbi Aryeh Clapper where he explains that, I'm going to quote him, there are 4 approaches to halachic infertility. And I'm going to go through each of these 4 approaches, and I'm not suggesting these are the way someone should go or even that they're halachically valid.
Oh, okay. When you said halachic infertility, I thought you were referring to infertility that occurs because by the time the woman gets to the mikvah, she's finished ovulating.
I should say how a couple deals with infertility, including halachic infertility. That would mean infertility which is brought on by keeping the laws of nidah.
Right.
Okay, so the first thing that Rabbi Clapper mentions is treating it as a purely physical problem, and this is going to sound very cruel. I'm being open about this. But theoretically, according to the halacha, if a husband has not fulfilled the mitzvah of pru or vu, and I say a husband because technically the mitzvah of pru or vu is on the husband, not on the wife, for whatever reason, there is a requirement codified in the Rambam and in the Shulchan Aruch that if 10 years have gone by without having children, the husband is supposed to divorce his wife. He is supposed to give her a get. I'll mention it's in Hilchot Ishut, Perek Tetvav, Halacha Zayin, Chapter 15, Halacha 7 in the Rambam. It's also in the Shulchan Aruch. The Machaber says it word for word, quotes the Rambam in Siman Kuf Nun Daled Sif Yud in Even HaEzer. That's Siman 154, section 10. But the Ramah, in that same place, says that practically speaking, we no longer enforce this. We no longer force the couple halachically to get divorced. And I believe practically speaking nowadays, while the halacha has not been abrogated, in practice, this is not really done so much anymore. This is generally not a halacha that's in practice. The next method that Rabbi Clapper talks about, apart from, well, you have to get divorced. It's a type of solution, so to speak. The next one is using alternate reproductive technology to impregnate the woman with her husband's sperm, like artificial insemination. We talked about this last time. Dr. Barron talked about some of the methods that are available. So that's using invasive medical techniques of the sort. The third method he talks about is using hormones to alter a woman's cycle so she ovulates later. This is talking about a woman who has presumably a short cycle. And because, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Talli, but I understand that women, not everyone's the same, but women generally get their period approximately 2 weeks after ovulating. And when a woman ovulates, she's fertile usually for a day before and a few days afterwards. That means in practice, if she has a short cycle, because of the laws of family purity, Hilchot Nidah, a woman does not go to the mikveh until 12 plus days after she gets her period. If she's ovulating during day 10 or day 11, or maybe day 9 or 8, practically speaking, it's going to be very difficult for her to be able to be impregnated because they're not allowed to have sex or to have physical contact until she goes to the mikvah on day 13. So one possibility that we're mentioning here is using certain hormones or medicines in order to delay her ovulation. By ovulating later, that allows her to still keep the laws of Nidah, go to the mikvah on time, and yet at the same time, because she's getting her period later and she ovulates later, she's able to get pregnant. And the fourth method mentioned by Rabbi Clapper is and this is the most controversial, frankly, on a halachic level, finding mechanisms within halacha which allow a woman to be lenient when it comes to those 12 days. Let me give a quick 1-minute background of how it works. When a woman gets her period, according to the way that Hilchot Nidah is practiced nowadays, which is not the same as it appears in the Torah, but as Hilchot Nidah is practiced universally nowadays, when a woman gets her period, she then waits until she stops bleeding, or 4 or 5 days, depending if you're Sephardi or Ashkenazi, whichever comes later, meaning a minimum of 4 days, or when she stops bleeding, or for Ashkenazim, a minimum of 5 days, or until she stops bleeding, after which you must wait another 7 days where she's not bleeding at all, making a total of 12 days. So one way, theoretically, that could be done is if you knocked off some of those 7 days. This is not a simple matter. In fact, I don't know anyone who allows it. But practically speaking, that's a question people can ask. Is there a reason that we have to wait the 7 days? Or easier on a halachic level is to cut down those initial 4 or 5 days, maybe to something less. There are ways of doing that. Although, frankly, if she's still bleeding, it doesn't really help anything. But let's say she only bleeds for 2 days, and there's a way of cutting back the 4 or 5 days to 2 days. That might be a different methodology. Again, I'm not advocating that halachically. I'm saying it would theoretically be a way of doing it should the poskim say that that's something that can be done. So that's Rabbi Clapper talking about how we handle the issues of infertility halachically.
Can I just make one comment? We are Anglos in Israel, but we are in Israel. That issue of using hormones to delay ovulation versus going to the mikveh early has been an ongoing debate in Israel as well, with, I believe it's Dr. Rosnak, who presented a paper on why it's unhealthy to use hormones and why it's a better option. And there were other rabbis who were vehemently opposed to that idea. But this has been talked about in the Israeli community as well.
Right, absolutely. So a few other halachic issues, Talli, that are worth mentioning. One of them is something which we referenced last time with Dr. Barron, the issue of non-vaginal ejaculation, either in the context of getting a sample of sperm to check the husband regarding fertility, or in the process of in vitro fertilization, IVF, and other methodologies. So there are different ways that it can be done. Dr. Barron mentioned the possibility of using a special kind of condom in order to collect the sperm, but while the husband and wife are actually having sex together. So in some level, halachically, that might be, quote unquote, the best method because they're having full sex and the only difference is the sperm is being collected, even though it's in the context of sex, he can then bring it over to the lab. Another method is the wife would stimulate her husband and cause him to ejaculate into a cup or into a vessel of sorts. And that's also a possibility. A third issue that could be a halachic issue is assuming the wife is a nidah and is unable to touch her husband, but at the same time, they are in the process of working on fertilization and treatments. It could be that he can manually stimulate himself. Again, I'm not talking about what's the right way or wrong way to do it. I'm simply mentioning that non-vaginal ejaculation is a halachic issue, and therefore this is something that halachic decisors have to talk about. Another issue is whether artificial insemination, while the woman is actually in a state of nidah, is permissible at all. For the record, Rav Moshe Feinstein says that it is, but it is a question that's mentioned. And finally, one thing I want to mention is something that Rav Eliezer Melamed talks about. If a person, chas v'shalom, has a disease such as cancer, let's say a man has a disease like cancer, and he's therefore afraid that because of his chemotherapy and radiation, after he hopefully is cured, he will be unable to have children. He won't be fertile. Rav Melamed says that he should freeze the sperm in advance in order to fulfill the mitzvah. And this even applies to a person who isn't married yet, but he's already bar mitzvahed. So therefore, even though he doesn't have a wife, he does technically have the mitzvah of pru urvu. And that would enable him to, when he does get married, to impregnate his wife, even if it's not in the natural way of intercourse, but some other way. These are some of the issues that I saw. There are many others as well, but I thought that was a reasonable overview of some of the issues that come into play when talking about fertility.
That's a very reasonable overview. So thank you for that. I was thinking of other issues, for example, like sperm donor when there's no way that the husband can provide sperm. And I'm sure that there are issues around that as well, but I suppose we could be speaking all day. I mean,
right. That question comes up with the question whether the child's a mom's there. There's all sorts of questions with that. Right. It's very complicated.
I'm sure that everyone knows this, but maybe not. There are organizations that are specifically dedicated to these issues. And in fact, it's interesting how so much of the halachic issues that have to do with men have to do with shvichat zera levatala, to the extent that in some Hasidic sects, they don't even allow any sort of testing for the man at any point. And they have to really kind of plead to the Admore to be able to get permission. Also, to the extent that I've had situations where I've heard that if you do have to provide a sperm sample, or if you have to provide sperm to freeze, because, for example, of that case of if you have cancer and you don't know if you're going to have treatments and you don't know how that's going to affect your fertility. And by the way, they do that for young women with cancer as well. They might recommend, certain organizations that are pretty, I would say, strict in these matters, might recommend electroejaculation or some sort of technical way to remove the sperm even from the man's testicle rather than have him masturbate. So that's interesting to know.
That's interesting too.
Yeah.
The reason I mentioned men freezing their sperm rather than freezing eggs is that Rav Melamed is talking about an obligation of sorts. And because the obligation of Puruvu falls upon the man, while a woman can do that, she's not obligated to do that. He at least says that a man, if he's able to, is obligated to try to freeze his sperm in order to fulfill the mitzvah. So it's a little bit of a different situation for men and women there.
I think that the extent to which there is so much taboo around the idea of providing sperm by the way that it's done in the society at large. And in society at large, they give you like porn and you go into a room with a cup. And I'm not saying that that wouldn't necessarily be quite shameful and humiliating, even to somebody who doesn't follow any of these kind of laws and doesn't have a essential problem with masturbation. I think that it can be. And I think that, what we learn from this is that we really can't minimize the emotional toll of this process because it's so different from the idealized understanding of how you make a baby.
Right. I think it's telling that our episode on masturbation, which was at the very beginning of season 1, I think it might be our single most popular episode of all time, which tells you how much people need to talk about this and need to hear different voices other than just the shame that normally is associated with it. But Talli, I want to hear from you now about some of the issues you want to discuss when it comes to fertility.
Okay, so just before I do an overview, I just want to comment again on the masturbation issue in the sense that sometimes that could be somewhat contributing to the infertility in the first place, in the sense that we will often see couples getting married where there is sexual dysfunction on the part of the man that is creating the difficulty, because some men who work very hard not to masturbate their entire single lives, and there are some that don't, they have a very difficult time teaching their body how to let go and ejaculate once they're married. So often we will have a couple not be able to even consummate the marriage. They're going to infertility clinics for treatment, but are not necessarily even asked if the marriage has been consummated. And this could be because of premature ejaculation. So there isn't even an opportunity to get to intercourse because the man is ejaculating too quickly, or anejaculation, which means he's unable to ejaculate at all, or maybe he'll ejaculate not during intercourse, but it'll happen in the middle of the night when his kind of defenses are down. Or sometimes it'll be because of the woman not being able to allow intercourse because of pain or because of vaginismus, which we had a whole episode about, or a combination of both. So we're also going to look at sexual dysfunction causing infertility or being a factor in infertility, as well as sexual dysfunction or sexual issues being an outcome of fertility and fertility treatments.
I'm just going to say one point about that in terms of the way that it exists in the Jewish world. And I'm not sure I want to say this, but I'm just going to say it. I was once in a shiur, a class, where a rabbi was talking about some of these issues. And he talked about somebody he knew. Every night, this person would take his underwear off and check it to make sure there wasn't a drop of semen on it.
Yeah, you mentioned that before.
I mentioned that before. That attitude, and he was saying this with admiration, saying how holy this person was. Fine, but that kind of attitude of a single drop of semen being this horrible type of thing that people have to be aware of the entire time they're single, and God forbid that a single drop come out. I'm not trying to undermine the halacha, but I can see how that could lead to sexual dysfunction once ejaculation is part of married life.
And it can lead to so much added distress in a couple that is challenged by trying to conceive and anyway are going through this monthly cycle of loss and grief and frustration and shame and guilt. And in addition to all that, They are worrying about every drop of semen that, has to get into the, halachic condom. And so I think that it's very understandable that some couples may really choose to find poskim who are more lenient and will say, look, there's so much distress around this whole situation. In addition to everything, having the woman kind of have to be part of the process. Now, often there are women that want to be part of the process. There are women that will say, this is great. I feel like we're having sex and then we're doing the procedure and it just feels more natural. But for many women, because of the issue of having to collect the sperm and, getting to the place on time, or having to take a hotel room close by, or doing it in a room in the hospital, those factors make it very, very difficult. And even if they are able to, Dr. Barron used the word perform, I prefer function, but even if they are able to, there's still a great deal of distress associated with it. And it's not romantic, and it's not sexy, and it's not fun. Often it feels very, very perfunctory. By the way, this is how having intercourse can feel for a couple who are working to have a baby. One of the things that we've talked about in the past, especially when we've talked about episodes of consent and the obligation that a woman often might feel to prevent her husband from masturbating or from spilling his seed, is that a woman can feel like an object. She can feel like a vessel because her vagina is the only legitimate place for him to ejaculate, and might, because of that, feel that she needs to have sex even when she doesn't want to. So think about that already as being an issue. And then think about what happens in infertility when there's an additional burden of having sex when you don't really want to, and an additional burden of using that halacha condom, of feeling like your body is an object to prevent the husband from sinning, so to speak. So I think that there's a lot to say about that. But I do want to just talk about maybe issues that are even more universal. Actually, before I go into issues that are more universal, as long as we're talking about halachic things, and that's really what intimate Judaism is all about, I also do want to point out that this is a very, very emotional time for couples. And again, every time there is a loss, a pregnancy loss, every time there is a period when you were hoping you were going to be pregnant, you are going to be overcome, both the wife and the husband. And there's a lot to say, too, about men and what they go through, because they don't have so many support groups to talk about this. Not that women have so many, but they certainly don't have such an outlet to talk about it. And it's very hard for them as well. By the way, often couples are not even on the same page. So that creates a great deal of distress. But the idea is that right when they need each other the most, right when there needs to be the most intimacy, right when the woman is like crying she got her period, if they do hug, they feel pretty guilty about it.
Because it's a violation of the laws of Nida.
Because it's a violation of the laws of Nida. So that's also...
Let me just explain why that's true. I assume what you're referring to is that when the wife gets her period, that's a sign that it didn't work, meaning their attempts to become pregnant didn't work properly. And that's also when she goes into Nida and is not allowed to touch her husband. So that's...
Or if she miscarries.
Right.
And, if she's been trying very hard and has had one miscarriage, another miscarriage. So many people say, well, this is skill building, because if you can't have physical intimacy, they can contain each other, they can communicate better, have more emotional communication. But often you're talking about really young people who really haven't learned those skills. And there is a very, very primal wiring to want to be held and to want to be comforted physically and to want to be soothed. So these are definitely issues that come up. And I'm sure that there will be more regarding specifically Jewish observant couples.
And by the way, Talli, I think that specific issue about hugging during the time of Nida when the couple is in distress, I think we actually mentioned that in our episode with Yoetzet Nechama Goldman Barish and Yoetzet Atara Ice. That was an issue that came up. And I've actually cited that podcast many times because of their differing views on that subject. So listeners should go back and listen to that again.
Great. So just to go back to what we are speaking about overall, I think that what we kind of understand from speaking to Dr. Barron and just from having this discussion is that going through this difficult process, something that comes very easily for some couples, when you're a couple where it doesn't come easily, it can really hit you hard on many levels. And it does cut across the areas of religion and spirituality. It cuts across the areas of your relationship with your own body. It cuts across the relationship with your partner, where there might be feelings of blame and projection and why is this happening? And maybe you're, kind of second guessing the relationship, often from a place of guilt and shame. Maybe you'd be better off without me. Sometimes I think that, I should let you go and marry somebody else who is fertile. These are very, very difficult feelings. So it cuts across the individual emotional feelings. It cuts across the couple's emotional feelings, the community, your family, not just you as a couple, but your mother-in-law, sister-in-law, mother. I mean, everybody's kind of interested in what's going on, and that balance between keeping your intimate life intimate, but also being able to talk about it and also being able to find support, not just emotional support, but also religious guidance that can offer emotional support at the same time. That's kind of hard to do.
Would you say that magical thinking is sometimes a problem here as well when it comes to these emotions? That, oh, it was because when I was younger, I wasn't Shomer Negia, or I slept around when I was younger. Like, does this come up?
Absolutely. This comes up all the time. First of all, it comes up when a woman has a miscarriage and she was kind of ambivalent about the pregnancy. And so she'll feel really guilty about being ambivalent about the pregnancy because she didn't really, maybe it was kind of a quote unquote mistake or accident. And then she got used to the idea and then it happens and there's guilt. There's guilt for feeling relief. There's guilt for feeling bad about the loss because you did attach to the idea, or even if you didn't attach to the idea, you still feel a great deal of loss. It's because we weren't shomer, or it's because I didn't really want the baby. That comes up a lot.
I gave an ayin hara, that sort of thing.
I gave an ayin hara.
I think it also has a lot to do, and obviously I'm just asking you if this is true, about a husband and wife's self-image. The husband can probably think, if I were a real man, then I'd be able to impregnate my wife. And the wife would say, if I were a real woman, I'd be a mother by now.
Absolutely. For the woman also, I think we have to recognize that often there's a history. For example, if infertility is coming from, let's say, a history of endometriosis, which is a condition where the tissue inside the uterus kind of spreads to other areas and creates pain and bloating. So she might have had difficulties with menstrual cramps. She might have had difficulties with having intercourse, maybe pain with intercourse, or another condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome. So women who are struggling with infertility are often the same women who struggled with their bodies throughout their life cycle. And so this is just another makat. It's another punishment. It's another hit on their self-esteem as a woman. Why do my woman parts not work for me? And so it absolutely creates this feeling of guilt. And for the man, exactly what you said. I'm not man enough. I can't provide my wife with what she needs. Maybe she should marry somebody else. It's devastating. And we also live in a kind of a toxic masculine culture where men are not allowed to cry, or they think that they can't, or they have to hide to do it. There's nobody to talk to. It can be an extremely lonely experience for the man. The man also doesn't want to go to his wife and say, it's hard for me because, she's going through so much. And this really brings us to the couple's dynamics around how each partner processes infertility and pregnancy loss.
When a couple wants to make a baby, I wonder if that process starts off perhaps as, oh, having sex, it's fun, and turns into a chore because every time it's a failure, it adds additional pressure and we have to do it now. I'm ovulating. How much does that factor into the couple's relationship and their emotional state when at certain points, couples often try to have a baby, but the longer they go without having one and they want to have one, I would think that puts an emotional burden that can negatively affect their sex life as a couple.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably the most common issue that will come up, is that something that was meant to be fun to do together. And a lot of couples in the beginning of wanting to get pregnant take it on with a certain amount of excitement. Great, let's do it. A lot of women who are motivated to get pregnant, something happens to them hormonally where their desire goes up and they do want to engage. And very quickly, it can start to change. Often the dynamic can be that the man begins to feel like the only time his wife wants to have sex is when she's ovulating. And suddenly, when she's ovulating, she's ready, willing. And when she's not interested. And then he feels just like he's the sperm provider. Sometimes she'll demand sex, like, I'm ovulating, hurry up, let's go. And again, going back to our culture of toxic masculinity, men are often perceived as being, ready and willing at just a moment, and they're not. They also are tired and they also are frustrated, and they can also feel a lot of pressure and anxiety and may not be ready to quote unquote perform.
It sounds a lot like the flip side of the woman thinking, I am his vessel.
It's kind of like the flip side. Yeah. It's kind of like feeling objectified. You just want to get pregnant. That's all you really want me for. That certainly can be something that can affect the couple. And it can actually, even like I said before, how sometimes sexual dysfunctions can contribute to infertility because of the inability to function. Often sexual dysfunction can result from it, especially if you begin to have intercourse completely perfunctorily and you don't even get aroused. So that can create dryness, that can create pain. For men, that can give them difficulties with having an erection. Sometimes women who are dry need to use a lubricant, but they're afraid to use a lubricant because some lubricants have substances in them that can destroy sperm.
In that case, Talli, tell me about some of the issues that come with the husband and wife not being on the same page, because we're talking about perhaps each one of them looking at their partner in a different way than they did originally. At first, it started off as a fun process, and now it's a chore, or it's something which is causing tremendous stress or grief or guilt. So when they're not on the same page, when they're not feeling the same thing, even if they both are interested in her getting pregnant, what's the thing that they should do at that point? Do they take a break? How do they ignite the spark so that they don't destroy the relationship in the process of trying to have a baby?
Couples are not going to be on the same page emotionally ever. I mean, we're different. And so obviously, you know what I'm going to say. Obviously, when going through difficult times, we have to be able to really communicate our feelings to each other. This is a very trying time. There are a lot of cultural myths and social myths. Men should always be able to perform, and women should, be receptive and available. And that doesn't always work out that way. And then when there's loss, there may be some more resources available to the woman. She can cry, she can be sad, but people aren't usually asking the guy how he's doing. And he has a loss too. And he doesn't always have a way to express it. And sometimes he gets lost in the condolences or compassion or kugels that his wife is getting, especially when it's a later pregnancy loss or a stillbirth or, something that is more public, that people know more about it. Couples may have a very different idea of what's going on with one another, where one partner may be a better coper in terms of recovering, maybe by having a lot of optimistic sort of belief systems, or maybe sweeping things under the carpet, denial, whatever it is. So they might say to their partner something like, oh, I didn't realize that it's still impacting you. Like they come home from a Shalom Zachor, a brie, and one is triggered and the other is surprised that the other one is triggered, for example. Those kind of things can happen if there isn't sufficient communication. What are you feeling? What was that for you? How are you doing, by the way? It really does require a lot of mutual containment and mutual compassion. Throughout the process, there are a lot of things that each partner needs to do, a lot more for the woman, that's true. But, even the idea of ejaculating in the cup can feel humiliating for the man. It can feel really hard, and it can feel very anxiety provoking. There's also the idea that, I said that this impacts religion, it impacts the couple, it impacts, socially, because of the fact that people don't talk about it, and your friends are all having babies and your siblings are having babies. You have each other. That's what you have. You have each other, and the ability to kind of come home and say, do you know what this person said to me? Or do you know what that person said to me? You have each other, and that's really an important resource. The other thing I want to say about that is that not every infertility or not every couple that aren't having kids is because of organic infertility. I don't think that we count couples who are afraid to get pregnant. There are women who have a great deal of anxiety and they just can't bring themselves to stopping birth control. They have a great deal of anxiety. I've had several couples in my practice where the woman cognitively says she wants to have a baby, but when it comes time to actually do the deed without protection, she's not able to do it. There are also women who are afraid of childbirth. It's called tachyphobia. It's a real fear. It's a fear of giving birth to the extent that they're afraid to get pregnant because they're afraid of childbirth. So I think that we have to realize that there's a lot more to seeing a couple who've been married for several years and assuming that they're infertile. Some couples may really be waiting, and some couples may really be unsure that they want to have a baby at all. And sometimes one person does want to have a baby and the other one doesn't. That can certainly create difficulty.
And that's really important, especially in some of our Orthodox communities where there's a general assumption, which may be false, that everyone obviously is going to have children right away. I live in Ramat Beit Shemesh, you're in Beit Shemesh. Obviously, life isn't really like that, but publicly, that's what everyone assumes. You get married and 9 months later, there should be a baby on the way.
Yeah, correct. And often that happens too because there haven't been conversations and because very young women didn't know that it would happen right away. And fortunately, there is a lot more awareness and a lot more education. And I think that it's even pretty standard that the first year, at least, couples take their time, especially young couples. And I think we see more and more young couples who really are wanting to complete their education. They do want to get married young, but they don't necessarily want to start having babies so young. But we are talking about couples that do want to have babies.
Talli, let me ask you about some recommendations that you have. And I want to divide this question into two different parts. First is something which we talked about last time with Dr. Barron a little bit. Recommendations for people who are in contact with couples that are struggling with fertility. It's a question that a lot of us have. What's the right thing to say? What's the right way to act? And as Dr. Barron said, there's no one answer. Perhaps you as a therapist can offer some general guidelines of how we should approach that. And the second part of the question is for the couples themselves. How should they handle this emotionally with each other, sexually with each other, in order to avoid some of the pitfalls that we're talking about?
Okay, so for your first question, I think that I would handle this the way that I would handle any kind of difficult conversation around loss, around grief, around illness, around anything that people generally find uncomfortable to talk about, acknowledging that everybody is different. Some people are very private and don't want to talk. Some people are very public and are happy to talk and happy when you ask them. Some people will be upset if they're not asked, and some people will be upset if they are asked. As Dr. Barron said, you are going to make mistakes. That's just par for the course, and you just have to acknowledge them. The model I like to work with is consent. Ask first if you can ask. Can I ask you about what you're going through? Is it something you would want to talk about?
Well, what about something else, Talli? What about, let's say, for example, a couple is having a baby and they're pregnant and they want to share this news with other people, but sharing it with these friends who may be struggling with fertility can trigger them and make them very upset. On the one hand, you can't pretend you're not pregnant. They're going to find out eventually there's going to be a baby. On the other hand, talking about it openly could be hurtful. It's very difficult to navigate this. And that's not about asking them. It's asking what I should do about talking about myself.
You have to go in understanding that you will probably get this wrong. Sometimes people can really appreciate knowing in advance. So, for example, if there's a family of children where they're all married and every sibling is having babies and one sibling is not, the one who is next having a baby might go to the siblings with infertility and say, look, I'm announcing to everybody something, but I want to let you guys know first. And they can know in advance so that they don't have to be shocked at the table, or so they can choose not to be at the table or whatever it is. But sometimes they might be offended. Like, why are you making assumptions? And I think the idea is that we do make assumptions. We should not make assumptions because every couple is different.
Unfortunately, the answer is there's no answer, and every person has to navigate
There's no answer
for him or herself.
You don't want to say things like, it must be really hard for you to, walk by the park when all these kids are playing in the park. Well, some people might like kids and like to be in the park and love to hold other people's babies. You really can't make assumptions. And that's why I just like to, ask, stay curious, and also recognize if you've made a mistake, recognize it.
And I think one thing is probably pretty clear. If you are talking to somebody who has problems with fertility, don't complain about how difficult it is raising your kids. That's more obvious. Say, oh, man, you can't imagine. It's so hard for me to get up in the morning to wake up my kids and bring them to school. I can't imagine that would be a sensitive thing to say.
But the other thing is also, obviously, don't say, well, when I had, if somebody just experienced a stillbirth and you even say, when I had my miscarriage, there is a hierarchy of grief, and people don't like it when they're grieving, when other people compare. People don't like it if they, God forbid, lost a spouse or lost a child. And you're talking about when you lost your 95-year-old parent. They often feel like, no, you're not getting it. It's not the same.
You don't understand.
Yeah. Kind of coming in with, I get what you're going through. You don't. You really don't. The assumption should be that you have no idea what they're going through. And, you can certainly ask, you can certainly offer to be there for them in whatever capacity they would need you to be, but don't assume that you know what they're going through. So I do want to go back to your question about the couples, what they can do.
Right.
The same thing applies to couples, not assuming what the other person's going through, staying curious about each other. What are you feeling? Really acknowledge each other, validate each other's feelings, being able to give empathy to each other. But I want to go back also to the sexual dynamic, because sex has turned into something very goal-oriented. And some couples end up not touching each other at all this entire period, except for when they're going to bed to have sex, to have a baby. That's what sometimes happens. And so the intimacy between them actually gets decreased rather than increased. They forget to touch. They forget to cuddle. They forget to just hug and hold each other, even though often when they're supposed to have intercourse and when they're not supposed to have intercourse is very much determined by doctors and nurses from the fertility clinic. They still have to maintain some autonomy over their intimacy and to choose sometimes to have sex defka when they're not ovulating, or to choose to have intimacy defka without sex, and to also have zones where they go out and are good to themselves and have a good time, and they don't talk about the fertility process. Non-fertility zones. Trying to avoid sex that's too mechanical. Trying to remember that even if you are already in a place of just needing to do it because it's technical, don't just do it to get it over with. Try to make it something that's mindful. Try to remember what you enjoy doing together. Not just going to do the deed, but maybe giving each other massages beforehand, or foreplay, not forgetting about that. And then sometimes a couple may choose, even though they know they're ovulating, to say, look, you know what? It's just too much this month. It's just too much. They're hopefully going to be both on the same page with that. And that's important, to be able to say, even if you're disappointed, to be able to say, look, I don't want to make you do anything that's going to make you feel uncomfortable. We can go another month. That requires a great deal of compassion and empathy for your partner. And I think that when you have that, you can get through this difficult time and Bezrat Hashem, get to where you want to be and have that baby.
It sounds like a lot of what you're saying now is that in the process of trying to have a baby, don't forget to have fun. Don't forget to communicate. Don't forget that you're also married and not just partners that enable each other to have a child. That it's all about making the relationship stronger and not allowing it to weaken and become a purely mechanical type of relationship.
Exactly. And talking about it. Again, there's a lot of information out there about sex. There's a lot of information out there about fertility. But there's not a whole heck of a lot of information out there about sexuality and infertility. And I think that this 2 series that we did is a very good start for, in the future, talking about sex during pregnancy, talking about sex during the postpartum period, talking about sex in middle age, menopause, and talking about sex in the older years. So look forward, because this is giving us a lot of ideas.
I was going to say, it sounds like you're planning the season of Intimate Judaism.
Absolutely.
Talli, just as a conclusion now, we're recording this before Rosh Hashanah. I don't know exactly when this is going to be released, but we're recording this before the Yamim Noraim. And to put on the rabbi hat once again, I think it's important that the power to feel is a real thing. And for those people who are suffering, I hope all of us are going to keep them in our tefillot and remember them, not only in terms of our relationship with them, but also to daven for them and to have them in mind, so that really to allow them to have what they want. And unfortunately in our community, as we've talked about before, unintentionally though it may be, we have such an emphasis on children, which is a good thing, but it leaves people left out. We have to actively, apart from our tefillot, bring people in, find ways for couples or singles or anybody else who's part of our community, but is not a classic husband, wife, children, family in the way that we are accustomed in the Jewish community, to bring everybody in and make nobody feel disenfranchised.
Especially during the Chagim, when people who don't have the standard family feel very, very left out. I'm really happy that in the list of people that you were talking about for tefillot, people obviously who have illnesses and people who want to get pregnant, to be able to also include people who are single and who want to be coupled. We want to wish for everybody to have all of their tefillot answered.
And for those people who are not coupled, they should still certainly be 100% part of our community and not to feel left out in any way whatsoever.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining us. Talli, I learned a lot. Thank you too. Check out the website, intimatejudaism.com. Share the podcast. Join our team on Patreon. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Go to jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Bye.